Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in maybe one more minute, waiting for everybody to join. All right, I think we can get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar from the Colorado Resiliency Office, Climate and Future Adaptations webinar series. This is our September, our quarterly presentation, and we'll be talking about risk reduction and innovation technology in the built environment today. So we're happy you're with us. Next slide, please, Jemmy. Thanks. We have one more of these for the year, November 14th, which will be around economic vibrancy and diversity. And as always, our recordings and updated future webinars will be available at our website there. For the duration of the webinar, please use the chat to communicate any questions or comments you have, and we'll have Q&A at the very end. If you'd like to throw in a Q&A question during our presentations, you can use that feature and it'll go to the panelists only. Everyone's microphone is on mute during the Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, we can unmute you. And then just a gentle reminder that this is being recorded and will be posted on the CRO website. Great. So a little background on the theme and what we're doing here today. This webinar aims to discuss how local governments can navigate climate action solutions through risk reduction in the built environment and potential uses of innovative technology. The first part of this webinar will be focused on the increasing risk of wildfires and how communities are approaching implementing risk reduction in their climate action plans. And the second part will continue this discussion into innovative technology in the built environment. And just kind of a note, Colorado is a wildfire state, and we've seen increasingly frequent extreme weather and impacts from that. We've also recently seen the risks involved with failures in the built environment through extreme weather, like the wildfires in Maui earlier this summer that led to both grid and water infrastructure failure. So as we know, all of these events are being exacerbated by climate change, and we're coming together today to kind of learn a little bit more about how the state and other local governments in Colorado are working to address that gap and build in technology and resiliency that can play a role in risk reduction. Next slide, please. A brief agenda. We just did a little bit of an intro. We'll be talking about wildfire risk and reduction with one of my colleagues, Carlin, and then we'll turn it over to two folks from some local governments here, both on the Front Range from Larimer County and from Lakewood. And then I'll be coming back on to talk a little bit about some innovative technology that the state is working on for grid resiliency. And then we'll end with Q&A. So here I am, and Carlin Vasson, who is the recovery planner, and we'll be talking a little bit more about wildfires and recovery efforts from the state. And then once we transition through that, we'll have Heidi Pruis, who is the Climate and Sustainability Manager with Larimer County, and then Caitlin Long, the Senior Sustainability Planner with the City of Lakewood, will each share their localities' efforts to reduce risk in the built environment. Great. Carlin, please take it away.
All right. Thanks, Julia. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take a few minutes to provide some context for thinking about risk reduction in the built environment and some new strategies that we can use to adapt to the changing climate. While many natural hazards are becoming more frequent and catastrophic, I'll use wildfires as an example, as I've been working on the Marshall Fire recovery more recently. In Colorado, we've seen that 5 out of the 9 largest wildfires have occurred in the past 5 years. And the Marshall Fire in December 2021 became the most destructive fire, with 2 lives lost, over 1,000 homes destroyed, and an estimated $1 billion in losses. Extremely high winds and very dry conditions quickly spread in a suburban environment that wasn't accustomed to planning for wildfires. So as we adapt to the impacts of climate change, we need to shift the mindset so we're proactively planning our built environment to live with wildfires. For decades, the focus has been on fire suppression through fuels reduction in forests. And while those efforts are still very important, we also need to think about how we can build our communities in ways that mitigate the risks to human life and property and reduce the losses. Next slide. So as we see the wildfires increasing in urban and suburban areas, we're learning more about wildfire behavior in that urban context. We know that embers are the most common cause of ignition. They can be blown through the air in high wind events and enter buildings through openings or vents and ignite the fires. Many homes are destroyed by the burning embers, not by the actual direct flames themselves. And in the suburban density, in the suburban context, density is also a factor. Homes are developed in very close proximity to each other, which leads to rapid spread of the fire between homes. And then the rapid spread is stoked by all the flammable building materials. This includes wood decking, fencing, mulch, flammable plants and trees, and accumulated debris next to homes and gutters and under decks. These become very dense fuels between structures during a fire. For the Marshall Fire, the area was also in close proximity, as we've seen with other fires, in close proximity to native vegetation, with open space and grasslands that were affected by the record high temperatures and drought that year. That created conditions for a fire to spread quickly into the suburban Superior, Louisville, and unincorporated Boulder County. Many communities not as accustomed to natural disasters are starting to proactively prepare and plan to manage the increased risks in their built environments. Next slide. So we just need to start developing our built environment with the knowledge that we will have wildfires, and how can we reduce the catastrophic destruction and losses. We want to start looking at community and neighborhood-wide risk reduction, because in denser areas, even if one home is following wildfire resilient measures, it's sitting right next to other homes that may have higher risk. This requires much more community education and preparedness training to raise awareness among community members that may not be accustomed to be thinking about wildfires. Local governments can also improve building codes and site development standards to account for increased risks. The Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, as an example, has been doing a lot of research on how fires burn through communities to determine what can survive and what materials are best. And these findings can be used to improve building codes and educate community members on home hardening mitigation measures that will make their homes safer. Fire resilient design has been shown to be very effective, and some examples include Class A roofing or steel roofs, windows with 2 or 3 panes to protect the home from high heat so embers don't come in when windows break or melt, using fire resilient materials like stucco, brick, fiber, cement boards, and stones, incorporating fireproof vents to block those embers from coming in, and of course, planting firewise landscaping around the homes to reduce risk. Also, the defensible space, paying special attention to the first 5 feet of that space around the home is important for safety, so that combustible materials are not close. We also need to strengthen incentives for individuals to learn about home hardening measures and make their homes safer, and therefore also their neighborhoods. Next slide. So in closing, I'd like to share just a few resources that the Colorado Resiliency Office has to help communities proactively prepare and adapt to changing conditions. One is the Planning for Hazards website that provides land use solutions for multiple hazards. Another is the Pre-Disaster Recovery Planning Guide that helps facilitate the coordination of disaster recovery efforts before a disaster occurs, so you can establish responsibility across recovery stakeholders. And then we also have a community readiness and resilience toolkit that is focused on building resilience and community scale at a community scale and helping them be ready for whatever shocks and stressors they're facing now or in the future. And finally, the Post-Disaster Recovery Toolkit includes steps for local governments to take in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. So I will put those links in the chat as well as my contact information, and feel free to reach out at any time if you have any questions, and I will pass it off back to Julia and then Heidi. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlin. Now we'll transition to Heidi Pruis, the Climate and Sustainability Manager at Larimer County.
Yeah. Thank you all very much for this opportunity. I was browsing through the attendees list and I see quite a few familiar faces. So thank you for joining us today. Next slide. What I'm going to do today is just describe a little bit about what's going on in Larimer County. You know, we have a suite of existing plans, including hazard mitigation plans, and we had a suite of natural disasters happening here in our county over the most recent history, which caused an awareness of climate issues and led to the application for a FEMA hazard mitigation grant that addressed some of these extreme conditions that have been experienced, and trying to figure out, okay, we've got these plans, but what is it that we're going to do about that to integrate climate? Next slide. So Climate Smart and Future Ready was born, you know, prior to my arrival here at Larimer County. There had been some efforts made to think about climate and climate impacts with staff, and that was our phase 1 framework effort. That took about a year, and there were a couple of recommendations that came out of that. One of those was we needed to do a little bit better with community outreach. What does this look like for our community? So phase 2 was that community outreach, and that's when I came on board with Larimer County. We took that community feedback and helped craft what went into our grant application that really helped to describe what is it that we're going to do as far as developing an implementable plan, recognizing that we have so many different plans, and trying to really understand this nexus of mitigation and adaptation, where those items fit together to maybe cause some discussion around innovation for implementation going forward, or certainly collaboration going forward. Next slide. So we did kind of we tried to think through, how can we come up with some collaborative innovations in the span of a year? A little tricky. So we knew we did not want to replicate our existing plans. But adding to those meant that we needed to identify who could be our collaborative partners in this endeavor. So we spent some time doing that. We knew that data was going to be very important, and sharing data across municipal boundaries, across private sector, nonprofit sector, public sector entities was a little bit tricky. So we knew we needed to focus on that. And of course, with this focus being, how is it that we're going to integrate climate changes in both mitigation and adaptation into our plans? How do we do that, knowing that there's vulnerable pieces of our community that we need to be sure that we are targeting and having some outreach for? Prioritizing those areas is not a simple thing, so we knew we needed to do that and then continue to engage the public. Next slide. So what we ended up with, we originally started with 4 priority focus areas, the 4th one being wellness and resiliency. And quickly, the discussions within the work group members said, nope, that needs to be integrated into those priority focus areas as a whole. So throughout the entire plan, wellness and resilience. So right now we have 3 focus areas: the built environment, circular economy, which is our waste services, business and jobs. That's one priority group. Mobility of people, goods, and services, everything transportation, natural environment, water, and agriculture. And we're really looking at what are the health risks throughout each one of those priority focus areas that are related to climate that need to be addressed and integrated into those existing plans. Same thing with land use and resilience. We have some overarching principles when it comes to policy and funding that we know that we still need to address, and we're in the process of doing that. And then what does it look like when we get to the end of this process? we have these action items, and how are we going to share information? How are we going to not only share information among the partners and the collaborators, but how is it that we're going to do that with the community as well? Next slide. So currently we have about 50 partner entities. And again, this is not just local governments, of which they are there at the table, but moreover our federal and state partners, nonprofit partners, private sector partners are all engaged in this work and split among those 3 priority focus areas. We do have an outreach tool that's outward facing called Social Pinpoint for the community, which is the bottom slide there with the yellow circle that has a focus right now on collecting equity data from the community as the working groups in those priority areas are putting forth some ideas and wanting some feedback. How does this impact equity in our community? But we're working through a lot. We have 22 strategies with more than 40 actions. So what our priority focus groups are doing right now is trying to consolidate those, really understand where there's synergies, where multiple partners and programs want to work together. How are they going to implement their projects? And so at the end, I don't expect for us to have that many strategies and that many actions, but that's where we are today in the process. Next slide. So how does this link back to our hazard mitigation plan? Currently, these 5 bullets include some of the draft language that we're working on as it's combined to kind of integrate our hazard mitigation priority areas with some of those actions that are gaining traction among our partners. So when we think about things like energy codes, land use codes, we know that there's an update coming. Just yesterday, we were talking to our county commissioners about the update to our codes and how we're going to integrate climate issues like energy ready, solar ready kind of components into those codes. Timing is really important when we talk about these strategies for mitigating and adapting that might include workforce and the like. So these topic areas are constantly referencing what's in our existing plans so that we can be sure we're taking advantage of the good work that's been done to this point, but also trying to build in new opportunities when it comes to maybe new partners working together. Next slide is my last slide. If you want to keep up with us and you want to know what's going on, you can use this URL QR code. The website's there. My email address is there. I encourage you to go on, take a look, and see what's going on. I look forward to your questions, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Heidi. Moving right along, we will hand it over to Caitlin, who is the Senior Sustainability Planner at the City of Lakewood. Thank you, Caitlin.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. We're on a similar path with our project to Larimer County, and so I'm taking close notes on what Heidi was doing since we're just earlier in the process. I want to tell you just a little bit more about what Lakewood's story in our relationship with hazard mitigation is, and how we've gotten to the point that we are now with trying to try to do a social vulnerability assessment and climate hazard type of study. So we adopted a sustainability plan in 2015, and this is kind of a holistic sustainability / climate action plan. It was adopted along with the 2015 comprehensive plan, so underwent a pretty lengthy public process as part of that. One of the chapters focuses specifically on climate change and adaptation. If you want to go to the next slide, please, with the goal of minimizing emissions and preparing to adapt to ongoing climate-related impacts. And one of those main strategies to achieve the goal is a climate change vulnerability study to explore the potential future climate changes and identify vulnerabilities. In preparation for doing that assessment, the city spent several years tracking and reporting on emissions, doing a couple of greenhouse gas inventories and that sort of thing. Next slide. Around the time that we had hoped to get started on doing our own vulnerability assessment, COVID happened. And so our work plan shifted gears for a little while. During that time, Jefferson County was also going through their hazard mitigation planning update process. And our city emergency manager, Jesse Miller, reached out to our sustainability team to participate in that process along with him. And so I was able to join him in that, and together with the other jurisdictions in Jefferson County, we included consideration of future climate impacts in the discussion of each hazard that's identified in the plan. So we were really excited to finally have a little bit of climate integrated into that hazard mitigation plan for the entire county. This was a good start. And on the next slide, we can see that with our more urban built environment in Lakewood specifically, our hazards are ranked a little bit different than the county overall. And we wanted to know more about how and where in the city these hazard risks are the highest. These highlighted ones are specifically related to weather and climate, and will climate change push them up from a medium to a high overall significance, and where are these hazards likely to be distributed around the city? So we included some language in our hazard mitigation plan, mitigation strategies around that. On the next slide, we also included, or the hazard mitigation plan also included, a discussion of social vulnerability in the county, along with a set of maps from the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. And in these maps, this is kind of a zoomed in portion of Jefferson County. We can see that the majority of the county's highly vulnerable census tracts are actually in the northeastern part of Lakewood. And so we knew that we needed to find out why it is so concentrated in that part of our city, what makes those census tracts more vulnerable, and then what the actual experience of climate change has been on the ground in these neighborhoods, so that we can tailor future actions to fit the context of those communities. And again, we have a mitigation strategy in the HMP to complete this overall climate hazard and social vulnerability study. Next slide. So our study is just getting started right now. We are finishing writing an RFP for a consultant to help us out with all this data collection. Hopefully that'll be out within the next week or so. And this is funded through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. It's intended to be a deep dive into data collection and research to help answer our key questions. How will climate change affect our hazards identified in the HMP? What factors make different parts of Lakewood more socially vulnerable to those hazards? And how can future hazards then affect those more vulnerable communities? This will include modeling of possible climate scenarios, evaluating the geographic impacts of those hazards, and considering socioeconomics, housing, transportation, and other demographic data about those particular vulnerable neighborhoods. It will also include more qualitative input from targeted parts of Lakewood to learn how those people have already been impacted by climate change and natural hazards. Next slide. We're hoping to accomplish a lot of that engagement with a stakeholder committee of representatives from some of the surrounding jurisdictions, local community-based organizations, as well as lived experience experts from the community itself. And we're hoping to pursue a variety of strategies. A lot of this our consultant will end up helping us out with to gain the community's real perspectives on what mitigation and adaptation strategy would actually help them in the event of an emergency. For example, we know anecdotally that many of our residents have older homes and rely on evaporative cooling or open windows to cope with extreme temperatures during heat waves. But when we have wildfires that have significant outdoor air quality impacts from far away, what do we do when there's smoke in the air and extreme heat at the same time? This happened a couple summers ago. And what can we do to help prevent there being a choice between two hazards that both negatively affect health outcomes? So we aim to have this report completed around the end of 2024. And the results of our study will be used to inform equitable policy decisions in our upcoming comprehensive plan and zoning code update. We are just kicking off that comprehensive plan update process in the city right now, and it will be closely followed by a zoning code update, and then the county's next hazard mitigation plan is anticipated to be updated again in 2026, so following right on the tails of that. Depending on how all of these other planning efforts go, we're also looking forward to opportunities for future climate action and sustainability planning efforts. We'll see what the needs are once we get through these other planning efforts and just see where we can fill in the gaps and what specific more strategic efforts are needed. And our goal is ultimately, if we go to the next slide, please. Our goal is ultimately to use the climate hazard and vulnerability study to help us look at things like emergency response protocols in terms of language, education, and cultural awareness needed to minimize risks, and some of these other opportunities to build upon our previous work at integrating hazard mitigation and other types of policy documents, these mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies, as well as environmental justice through the comprehensive plan, through the hazard mitigation plan. And so we're eager to see where we are in a couple of years and just how integrated we're able to get. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caitlin. And I will take over for a little bit to talk about innovative technology for risk reduction. I don't think I introduced myself fully at the beginning, so I will do that now. My name is Julia Masters. I'm the program manager for the Microgrids for Community Resilience grant program out of DOLA. And we can go to the next slide. So as a state, we're taking a multi-pronged approach to addressing grid resiliency and grid reliability in the face of climate change. Three of the ways of many that we're doing this. One is through this grant program that I'm managing, MCR, which I'll talk to a little bit more. There's a federal DOE GRIP application out from the state of Colorado supporting wildfire mitigation grid resilience. And then we also just received some Department of Energy federal funding that will support grid hardening and advanced grid monitoring. So kind of all supporting the general goal of making our grid more resilient in a number of different technology and approaches. So next slide. The MCR grant program. So in 2022, House Bill 1013 set aside $3.5 million to support rural communities to plan for and develop microgrids that will increase resilience against infrastructure, climate, and socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And to take a quick step back, a microgrid, for those who don't know, is essentially any sort of generation, so a solar, wind, or natural gas that is paired with storage, so a battery system, and it has a controller with it. So if there is a blackout somewhere on the grid, the controller can redirect that and kind of island this energy source so it can go to the hospitals or go to the school or wherever kind of needs that additional energy. It can also help with reducing the risk of blackouts if there isn't one. So there's kind of a lot of different applicabilities to a microgrid, but they're generally thought of as a pretty resilient measure for communities that see extreme weather or remote and rural and in the mountainous regions who have frequent downed lines and things like that. Enhancing grid resiliency has many co-benefits, again, not just for protecting against black and brownouts, but also for ensuring communities have access to emergency services and communication. This process, so we have successfully awarded 8 planning grants in our first round of funding, and we will be launching shortly a round of 2 rounds of construction grants and another round of planning grants. And as you can see, it's highlighted that this process has really shown us the importance of a regional or a service-wide territory approach. So in Colorado, there are, I don't remember the exact number, something like 40 something rural utilities or municipal utilities, in addition to our 2 large investor-owned utilities, Xcel and Black Hills Energy. And you could imagine that for those 40 or so small utilities, making sure that all of the service territory they're covering is reliable and resilient is a challenge as it's piecemeal. So this grant is meant to really support our rural parts of the state that desperately need funding to be able to improve their resilience. And the next round of construction and planning grants, as I mentioned, will be opening soon, and we'll be also sharing a public engagement session at the end of next week. One thing that is not on this slide that I'll note, if this is piquing anyone's interest, We only accept utilities as the prime applicant for this grant program. If your community is thinking about developing these assets on behalf of, all the city buildings, or you have a specific area that you're thinking needs additional grid reliability, we are really open to trying to connect you guys with the right folks at your utility, helping to broker that conversation. So if anyone is interested, or if this is kind of piquing your thoughts around projects in your own area, I will throw my email in the chat afterwards and we can talk a little more. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned that we had awarded 8 planning grants in our first round of funding. This map on the left shows the pins of the various locations of those microgrids. As you can see, there's a pretty high proportion that are out west in the western slope near Telluride and Grand Junction, but they're pretty scattered throughout the state. I have on here an example of one of our planning grants we funded with San Miguel Power Authority, who is developing a microgrid that will support their communications equipment for the utilities. So if there is a black or brownout, the physical location that the utility, oh, yes, it is. I'm sorry for that typo. What was I saying? Oh, the physical location where the communication detail is, if there is a blackout and that building loses power, then the entire service territory obviously would struggle to be able to be informed and share emergency details and kind of timing for when the power was going back on. So this is one innovative approach in taking a grid reliability framework and applying it directly to the utilities service territory kind of home base. And in the slide deck, which will be on our website, you can click on that link that shows the full list of the 8 projects that we have been funding. We're really excited to see what other projects are proposed in this next round. Next slide, please. And then finally, I just wanted to throw in some other state-led grid resiliency efforts. As I mentioned, this GRIP funding, the Colorado Energy Office was leading on that. I believe we should be hearing back from DOE on this. I think anytime now, but it worked with 15 or 20 utilities in the Colorado region around wildfire mitigation technology and monitoring efforts. And so that would be a pretty big boost to our ability to monitor and prepare for wildfires around our grid infrastructure. Another example, through DOLA, actually, we applied on behalf of 3 communities for this Energy Improvements in Rural and Remote Areas grant program from DOE. It was specifically for communities under, I believe, 5,000, and we took an approach of kind of being the prime applicant and supporting some localities in their efforts to increase their energy efficiency and reliability. So those 3 communities were Pitkin County, La Junta, and the San Luis Valley Rural Electric Co-op. So those 3 folks worked with us, and we should again be hearing back on that program later, I think this fall. And then finally, the state is in the process of submitting a Solar for All proposal to DOE, which would support low-income housing developments for solar projects throughout the state. So just kind of a few examples of the ways that the state of Colorado's efforts are trying to meet the localities and regional efforts where they're needed, and really be as supportive as possible for getting this money back to you guys. Next slide. Great. All right, well, that was all I had. We will transition to the Q&A portion of this. If folks have questions, you can raise your hand or you can throw your questions in the chat, and we can unmute you if you'd like to speak it instead. I will just, while we're waiting for the burning questions, I will throw my email in the chat in case anybody wants to reach out about the microgrids program. All right, we've stunned them with no questions, folks. Good job to the panel. We will stick around a few more minutes in case anybody has additional questions. Thank you all for joining us and participating in this discussion. And yeah, we look forward to connecting and furthering the good work you all are doing. Our next webinar will be November 14th, same time from 12 to 1, and the topic will be economic vibrancy and diversity. We hope to see you there.